In the 1950s, Detroit could turn a simple arrival into a complete spectacle. Chrome that looked like jewelry, impossibly low roofs, enormous hoods, colors that no manufacturer today would dare to offer, and designs created in an era when an automobile could still be elegant without looking like anything else. Some were discreet, others absolutely extravagant. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the 1950s so fascinating. There was no single way to create a beautiful car. These are 10 of the most elegant and unforgettable American automobiles of that era, and we begin with one that did something almost revolutionary for its time, proving that true luxury did not need to shout. 1956, Continental Mark II. While Detroit was beginning to discover that fins could grow taller and taller and that there never seemed to be enough chrome, this car took the opposite path. The Mark II was long, low, and extraordinarily clean. It did not need enormous ornaments to show how much it cost. All it took was one look at that endless hood, the thin roofline, the perfectly proportioned fenders, and that discreet bulge over the trunk hiding the spare tire to understand it. Even while standing still, it looked designed to glide down the road effortlessly, and there was a reason it felt so different. Although many people today incorrectly call it the Lincoln Continental, the Mark II was not officially a Lincoln. Ford created an independent Continental division to build it, under the direction of William Clay Ford, with an ambition that was quite simple to explain and very difficult to execute: to build one of the finest luxury automobiles in the world. That is why its design, created by John Reinhardt, deliberately rejected much of Detroit's more flamboyant styling trends. But what was truly impressive began when you discovered how it was built. Each Mark II required approximately twice as many labor hours as a contemporary Lincoln, underwent extraordinarily rigorous quality controls, and left a factory dedicated almost entirely to it. Ford used high-quality chrome, interiors that could be trimmed in Scottish bridge of weir leather, and to prevent damage during transportation, the cars were even shipped to dealerships protected by special padded covers. Naturally, that level of obsession came at a price. When new, a Mark II cost around $10,000 in 1956, approximately twice the price of a Cadillac Series 62. Equipped with air conditioning, it could exceed that figure and approach the price of some of the world's most prestigious European automobiles. And even then, Ford lost money on every unit sold. And one of the best demonstrations of its exclusivity is simply how few existed. Between 1956 and 1957, around 3,000 Mark IIs were built. That was almost insignificant production for a company the size of Ford. What is curious is that this exclusivity did not produce an extravagant design. It produced exactly the opposite. Look at it beside many American automobiles from the end of the decade, and the Continental almost seems restrained. It does not have the largest fins. It does not have the most chrome. It does not try to look like a spaceship. And more than 70 years later, perhaps that is exactly why it still looks so elegant. 1958, Buick Century Caballero Estate Wagon. Now, imagine taking all the extravagance of a 1958 Buick and turning it into something that, in theory, was supposed to carry luggage and take the entire family on vacation. The result was one of the most extraordinary station wagons of its time. The Century Caballero had 4 doors, an enormous body, and all the space expected from an American family car. But there was one detail that completely changed its appearance. It had no visible center pillars between the doors. Lower all 4 windows and that enormous side was left almost completely open from end to end, just like one of Buick's elegant Riviera hardtops. It was an especially daring idea for a wagon, a type of automobile that normally prioritized utility over glamour. And then Buick wrapped all of that in one of its most exaggerated designs. 1958 was probably the year when the brand took chrome the furthest. The enormous grille was made up of 160 small, bright squares. The dual headlights were surrounded by thick moldings, and the body was crossed by stainless steel lines that seemed to multiply the longer you looked at it. It may be excessive. In fact, even at the time, some people thought it was. But on the Caballero, that excess had a particular charm. It was as if Buick simply refused to accept that a station wagon had to look boring. And it was not an inexpensive family car either. As part of the Century range, it carried the 364 cubic inch V8 producing 300 horsepower, paired with the Dynaflow transmission, enough to move its more than 2 tons with quite surprising ease for a wagon from the late 1950s. Its price also said a great deal about the audience it was aimed at, $3,831 in 1958, making it Buick's most expensive station wagon. And curiously, that did not stop it from becoming Buick's best-selling wagon that year. Even so, we are talking about only 4,456 units, and 1958 was also its farewell. Buick abandoned this peculiar hardtop station wagon concept after only 2 years, leaving the Caballero frozen in one of Detroit's most creative and extravagant periods. That is exactly what makes it so special on this list, because alongside coupes, convertibles, and luxury automobiles built to impress, there appears an enormous 6-passenger family wagon that managed something quite difficult: to be practical without giving up the spectacle for even a second. 1959 Pontiac Bonneville Sport Coupe. Some cars look big because they really are. And then there is this Bonneville, which looked even bigger because Pontiac did everything possible to bring it visually closer to the ground. It was incredibly wide, low, and clean. The hardtop roof seemed almost suspended above the enormous glass area. The pillars were extremely thin, and the body stretched for more than 18 feet. But the detail that truly changed its personality was at the front. 1959 was the year Pontiac's distinctive split grille appeared. At the same time, the brand moved the wheels outward toward the edges of the body, widening the track by almost 5 inches compared with the previous year. Pontiac turned that into an expression that would follow the brand for decades: wide track. It was not merely advertising. The new stance made the car look more planted, wider, and considerably more modern than the Pontiac of just 1 year earlier. And that change was far more important than it might seem. For much of the 1950s, Pontiac had a respectable but relatively conservative image. Under the direction of Bunky Knudsen, the division began to shed that personality. The old silver streak chrome strips disappeared, the proportions changed, and the Bonneville came to represent a much younger, more sophisticated, and more performance-oriented Pontiac. The public responded. The brand's sales jumped from around 217,000 units in 1958 to more than 382,000 in 1959, taking Pontiac from 6th to 4th place in the American industry. The Sport Coupe was probably the most elegant way to see it. With no center pillar, an enormous wraparound windshield, and an extraordinarily low roof, it managed to make a car around 80 inches wide look even longer. And at the rear, Pontiac resisted the temptation to compete with Cadillac by using gigantic fins. It had small twin fins, but they were much more integrated into the body. Under the hood was the new 389 V8, which in the Bonneville normally produced 300 horsepower. Anyone who wanted something more serious could order the famous Tri-Power, with 3 two-barrel carburetors and 315 horsepower in its street configuration. But here, the power almost seemed to complement the design. This car truly had the presence its numbers promised. And we are not talking about a rarity built by the hundreds. Pontiac produced 27,769 Bonneville Sport Coupes in 1959. Its beauty did not depend on being inaccessible. Thousands of Americans could see one driving along the avenues when it was new. Perhaps that is why it represents the end of that decade so well. Now I want to know, which of these two philosophies convinces you more? The clean, restrained elegance of the Continental Mark II, or the low, wide, and much bolder presence of this Bonneville? Leave your choice in the comments, because when we talk about the 1950s, choosing the most beautiful one is rarely as easy as it seems. 1958 Plymouth Fury. So far, we have seen restrained elegance, family luxury, and enormous hardtops that seemed to occupy the entire road. But the Plymouth Fury had something different. It was beautiful, yes, but it also had a slightly threatening presence. Much of that personality came from Virgil Exner's famous forward look. Plymouth had changed radically just 1 year earlier, abandoning tall, conservative shapes for much lower bodies, large glass areas, and rear fins that seemed to rise naturally from the fenders. For 1958, the 4 headlights and small changes to the grille completed the Fury's distinctive expression. And the Fury was even more special than it looked. Plymouth offered it only as a 2-door hardtop, and everyone left the factory in buckskin beige, combined with spectacular gold, anodized aluminum side panels. There was no long list of colors to choose from. If you wanted a Fury, that was its identity. The result was curious. While many 1958 cars use very strong contrasts to attract attention, the Fury blended that light tone with gold in an almost sophisticated way. Then came the enormous fins, the wraparound windshield, and an extremely thin roofline to remind you that you were still looking at one of Detroit's boldest designs. And beneath that appearance, there was much more than decoration. The 318 V8, producing 290 horsepower with two 4-barrel carburetors, was standard. And for anyone who wanted to turn that elegant hardtop into something much more serious, Plymouth offered the new 350 cubic inch Golden Commando, producing 305 horsepower. In period tests, a Fury equipped with that engine and torque flight could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 7.7 seconds, a genuinely fast figure for 1958. But there is a wonderful irony surrounding this car. Ask many people what color a 1958 Plymouth Fury is, and they will probably answer immediately: red. We have Christine to thank for that. Stephen King's novel, and especially John Carpenter's film, transformed the red and white Fury into one of the most recognizable automobiles in cinema. But a red Fury like Christine never left the factory that way in 1958. In addition, modified Plymouth Belvederes and Savoys were also used during filming to resemble Furies, because finding enough genuine examples was already difficult. And that is not surprising. Plymouth built only 5,303 Furies in 1958. Decades later, Christine turned its silhouette into something sinister. But cinema simply took advantage of a characteristic the car had from the beginning. With those fins, that low roof, and an expression that seemed to watch you even with the engine turned off, the Fury was one of those rare cars that could be elegant and intimidating at the same time. 1953. Oldsmobile 98. Before the gigantic fins, dramatically wraparound windshields, and the obsession with looking like a spaceship, American cars could already be spectacular in a much more classical way. And few represent that moment better than the 1953 98. It was the automobile at the very top of the Oldsmobile range. Large, long, and covered in enough chrome to make it clear that you were not looking at an ordinary model, but it still retained those rounded, substantial shapes of the early part of the decade, when American elegance depended more on enormous fenders, generous proportions, and carefully placed details than on fins growing taller every year. And among all its body styles, the Holiday Coupe was probably the one that best displayed that philosophy. Without a center pillar interrupting the side, the roof appeared much lighter over an enormous body. The long chrome moldings partially covered rear fenders, and two-tone paint combinations managed to transform an automobile weighing nearly 2 tons into something surprisingly refined. The holiday concept was not new either. Oldsmobile had helped popularize this pillarless hardtop style since the late 1940s, combining the open silhouette of a convertible with the comfort of a closed coupe. By 1953, that formula had already become one of the brand's most desirable images. And unlike some of the ultra-rare automobiles on this list, the 98 did not need extreme exclusivity to be special. The Holiday Coupe alone accounted for 27,920 units in 1953, with a base price of around $2,771. It was an expensive and prestigious car, but still accessible enough to become a real presence on American roads. That also gives it a different kind of charm, because the Oldsmobile 98 does not represent a prototype transformed into a production automobile or an extravagance created for a handful of privileged buyers. It represents something perhaps even more interesting: what American luxury looked like just before Detroit decided to take everything to the extreme. 1959, DeSoto Fireflite Sportsman. There is something almost ironic about this car. While DeSoto was beginning to lose its place within Detroit, its designers were still creating some of the most spectacular automobiles in the entire industry. And the Fireflite Sportsman seemed determined to make sure no one forgot the brand. Under the direction of Virgil Exner, the famous forward look had completely transformed Chrysler's products. The bodies became lower, the windshields more wraparound, and the fins stopped looking like simple add-on ornaments and became part of the entire silhouette. In the Fireflite, that formula reached an extraordinary level. From the side, A long molding ran along the fenders until it met enormous rear fins, while up front there were 4 headlights, a thin mesh grille, and that peculiar bumper with 3 large air openings. It was extravagant, but there was coherence in the excess, and DeSoto allowed buyers to take it even further. For 1959, the brand offered no fewer than 26 solid colors and around 192 tone paint combinations. It was an era when choosing the right color could completely change the personality of the automobile. The Fireflite was not there simply to look good either. Under the enormous hood was a new 383 cubic inch V8 with a 4-barrel carburetor and 325 horsepower, connected to the 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic transmission. For a luxury hardtop weighing around 4,080 pounds, it was more than enough power, but probably the most interesting figure appears when we look at its sales. The 2-door Sportsman cost around $3,831, a considerable sum in 1959, and only 1,393 examples found buyers. The 4-door Sportsman was not a mass-market success either, just 2,364 units. It was not simply a problem with this model. DeSoto was going through a deep decline. The 1958 recession had hit the brand hard, and, although the American market began to recover, its production for the 1959 model year remained at approximately 45,700 automobiles. Soon afterward, the range began to shrink, and DeSoto disappeared completely in 1961. And now, I want to ask you something. Between the 2 forward-look representatives we have already seen, which one would you park in your garage? The elegant and slightly threatening 1958 Plymouth Fury, or this enormous and much more exclusive DeSoto Fireflite Sportsman? Leave your choice in the comments. I want to see which of these 2 Virgil Exner designs gets more votes. 1959 Chevrolet Corvette. By 1959, the Corvette was no longer that uncertain gamble Chevrolet had launched just 6 years earlier. Now, it had something much harder to achieve, an identity of its own. Its proportions were still compact, compared with almost everything else on this list, but the design had matured enormously. The long hood, rounded fenders, wrap-around windshield, and famous concave side coves formed a silhouette that blended American sportiness with an elegance far lighter than that of Detroit's enormous hardtops. And curiously, the 1959 model improved precisely because Chevrolet decided to remove things. The 1958 Corvette had received 4 headlights, more length, and plenty of decoration, including fake hood louvers and 2 large chrome strips running across the trunk lid. For 1959, those elements disappeared. The result was practically the same body, but much cleaner and better balanced. Even period publications pointed out how that simplification had improved its appearance. And that made it especially interesting at the end of a decade obsessed with adding more. While Cadillac, Dodge, and many other brands were taking fins and chrome further and further, the Corvette proved that an American automobile could also attract attention by being small, low, and relatively simple. Under the hood remained the 283 V8, with a wide variety of configurations. The standard engine produced 230 horsepower, while the most powerful fuel-injected configuration reached 290 horsepower, enough to turn that elegant roadster into a genuinely serious sports car for its time. But perhaps the figure that best shows how much the Corvette's situation had changed is found in its sales. In 1953, Chevrolet had built only 300 examples. In 1959, 9,670 Corvettes left the factory. It was still a special automobile, but it was already leaving behind its status as an experiment and becoming an American institution. And visually, few years of the first generation achieved such a good balance. A low, clean body that was distinctive enough to look unlike any other American automobile of its time. 1957 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham. If the Continental Mark II represented American luxury through restraint, Cadillac decided to answer in a completely different way. The Brougham was meant to demonstrate how far Detroit could go when price limits practically did not exist. And the first surprising thing was its appearance. Despite being an enormous 4-door Cadillac, it stood only 55.5 inches tall, around 3.5 inches lower than a conventional Series 62. The roof looked incredibly low over the body. There was no large center pillar interrupting the side view, and the rear doors opened in the opposite direction. Above all of that was one of its most recognizable details, a spectacular brushed stainless steel roof. It did not simply look like a more expensive Cadillac. It looked like one of the cars from the Motorama that had somehow escaped the show floor and reached the streets. And in a way, that was exactly what had happened. Its design had evolved from concept cars such as the Cadillac Orleans and Park Avenue, and the production model retained many of those ideas that only a few years earlier had seemed too futuristic to sell to the public. But it was inside where Cadillac truly abandoned any sense of restraint. Air conditioning, power windows and locks, a power front seat with position memory, power trunk opening, and a sophisticated self-leveling air suspension were all part of the standard equipment. And then there were the smaller excesses. Cadillac included magnetized metal drinking cups inside the glove compartment, a cigarette case, mirror, comb, notepad with pencil, and even a small perfume atomizer. These were not options placed there simply to improve an equipment list. They were part of the experience Cadillac wanted to sell. Under the hood was a 365 cubic inch V8 with two 4-barrel carburetors and 325 horsepower. But even that figure ended up seeming secondary compared with the rest of the car, because the real madness was in the price. The Eldorado Brougham cost $13,074 in 1957. A Continental Mark II was around $10,000, while the Eldorado Biarritz convertible cost only $7,286. The Brougham even became more expensive than some contemporary Rolls-Royces and Bentley models. Cadillac knew perfectly well that this would never be a high-volume automobile. Only 400 examples were built during 1957. And perhaps that explains why, among so many famous Cadillacs from that decade, the Brougham still feels different. The 1959 Eldorado would be more extravagant, and its enormous fins would become a symbol of an entire era. But if we are talking simply about sophistication and elegance, this low, clean Cadillac, with its stainless steel roof and almost concept car proportions, may have been even more special. 1955, Chrysler C-300. At first glance, this Chrysler looked too elegant to have anything to prove. It did not have enormous fins, nor was it covered in ornaments. In fact, compared with many cars that would arrive only a few years later, the 1955 C-300 was surprisingly clean. But that appearance hid a completely different personality. Virgil Exner took the new Chrysler New Yorker body, incorporated that enormous split grille inspired by the Imperial, and reduced much of the side decoration. The result was a long, low two-door hardtop with an almost intimidating presence. It did not look delicate, it looked confident, and there was a good reason. The name C-300 referred directly to what was under its hood, a 331 cubic inch firepower Hemi V8, equipped with two 4-barrel carburetors and capable of producing exactly 300 horsepower. Today, that may seem like just another number. In 1955, it was extraordinary. The C-300 became the first American production automobile to officially reach that horsepower figure, and Chrysler paired the engine with heavy-duty suspension and a much more serious setup than one would normally expect to find in a large luxury coupe. And then came the best publicity possible. In the 1955 NASCAR competitions, the Chrysler 300s prepared by Carl Kiekeifer's team became a dominant force. Tim Flock won 18 races and finished the season as champion. The C-300 appeared halfway through the model year, cost around $4,100, very close to Cadillac Coupe de Ville territory, and only 1,725 units were built. That also began a story that would continue for a decade. In 1956 came the 300B, followed by the 300C, and so on until the 300L of 1965, creating the famous family of Chrysler letter cars. And I want to know your opinion. Can a high-performance car be as elegant as a Cadillac or a Continental? Or do you think true 1950s luxury should be more refined and less aggressive? Leave your opinion in the comments, because this Chrysler proves that beauty and brutality could coexist remarkably well. 1959 Dodge Custom Royal Lancer. If one car had to be chosen to represent the moment when Detroit decided to push 1950s design to the limit, this Dodge would have more than enough arguments. It was enormous, low, wide, and absolutely incapable of going unnoticed. It was part of the final great development of the forward look, and by that point, Dodge was no longer trying to be discreet. The fins were longer and taller than before. The four headlights were deeply integrated beneath enormous chrome eyebrows, and the body stretched to almost 18.1 feet in length. Everything seemed to have been stretched, lowered, and exaggerated at the same time. But the version that truly interests us was the two-door Lancer. That name identified the pillarless hardtops, and in the Custom Royal, the highest trim level in the Dodge range, the formula worked especially well. With the windows lowered, that enormous side was left almost completely open, making the roof appear to float above a body that was already extraordinarily long, and the rear was probably even more spectacular. The enormous flight-swept fins grew out of the rear fenders and ended around increasingly pronounced taillights, while chrome ran along much of the body. Even the interior followed that philosophy. There was a peculiar horizontal speedometer that changed from green to yellow and then to red as speed increased. And among the options were swiveling front seats that could rotate toward the doors to make getting in and out easier, one of those small, futuristic details that seemed fascinating in 1959. The mechanical side was equally impressive. As standard, the Custom Royal carried a 361 cubic inch Ram Fire V8 producing 305 horsepower, and the Super D 500 package with two 4-barrel carburetors could reach 345 horsepower. But for this car, the numbers are almost secondary. Only 6,278 two-door Custom Royal Lancers were produced in 1959, and that would also be the final year of this generation and of the Custom Royal name itself. Beginning in 1960, Dodge would enter a new stage of design. That turns this model into a kind of perfect farewell. Because after a decade in which Detroit experimented with chrome, panoramic windshields, enormous hardtops, bold colors, and increasingly taller fins, the Custom Royal Lancer seemed to bring practically all of it together in a single body. It was not discreet. It did not try to be. And precisely for that reason, it is difficult to imagine a better car to close this list. And so, we finish this journey through some of the most elegant and spectacular American cars of the 1950s. Now, I want to leave the decision to you. If you could choose only one of these 10 cars to have in your garage today, which one would it be? The refined Continental Mark II, the extravagant Dodge Custom Royal Lancer, the ultra-rare Eldorado Brougham, or something completely different? Write it in the comments and also tell me which car you think was missing from this list. I want to see which model gets the most votes and, above all, discover those 1950s gems that still deserve to appear in future videos. And if you enjoyed this era, there is still another fascinating side for us to explore. Because the 1950s proved that even a car created to carry the whole family could have as much style as a great luxury coupe. We already made a complete video about the most elegant American station wagons of the 1950s. Click the video appearing on your screen now and continue this journey with us.